Hi, this is Karen at the Meaning Code. Today, I'm going to be talking with Matt about philosophy and about a novel that he's writing. We are the Meaning Code, and we explore reality by whatever means possible. Hi, Matt.
Hello, Karen.
Good to talk to you again. I'm looking forward to our meeting next week as well.
As am I. As am I. It was a nice way to come to the Bay, meet Karen and all the others at the meetup in Silicon Valley, or there too.
Okay, you just gave us a good promotion in case anybody's watching. I'll
Yeah.
put the I'll put the meetup link in the notes after our talk.
Cool.
Okay, so I introduced you at the beginning um, as a philosopher and a novelist. And well, maybe novel was the wrong word. Are you writing a nonfiction book or a fiction book?
Oh, see, I like what you do, Karen, in terms of starting with the widest frame one can conceive of, and then look for the where to put the spoon to turn the fabric, right?
Yes.
So, like, is it autobiography? Is it fiction? Like a folk tale? It's somewhere in between. And where does philosophy come in? It's kind of like a spoon. You can put it in a lot of things, the philosophical instrument of analysis or synthesis, and you never know what you're going to get. Kind of like that guy who ran across the country. It was one of his early films, Forrest Gump, right? You never know what
Oh,
you're going
yeah.
to get when you open a philosophical text, because it's a bunch of, it's a bunch of jargon and somebody else's lexicon that takes time to figure out what they mean behind the meaning of the word, because they don't mean the connotation or the denotation of the word necessarily. They're using it in some kind of tangential way.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm really looking forward to speaking with you, because I have not studied philosophy as an academic subject. And so I'm not familiar with all the terminology. I have an idea in mind of various philosophers who've had an impact on history and on, the way we think today and so forth. But whenever I get, there's somebody I follow on Facebook who's a devotee of philosophy, and all the commenters on her post are also philosophers. And when they get into a discussion, they're using so much language that I have no idea what they're talking about. It's like I need an interpreter to even enter in, even to imagine what the conversation is about. So
Mm.
I'm looking forward to,
No,
what
you
we're
just
talking
hit a
about.
nerve with me of a meaningful nerve in me, in my, like, what is Jordan B. Peterson called it, the solar plexus was opening, because I was resonating with what you said. There is a, like, 95% of philosophical study is figuring out what the conversation's about.
Yes.
And you can take that 95%, and for the last 2,000 years, it's been a running to the entrance of the door to get into the symposium, to figure out what everyone's talking about.
Yeah, and I also like, there's something in Maps of Meaning, I think, where Jordan Peterson is talking about why he wrote the book. And it goes back to his experience of suffering and struggling so much, thinking through the Holocaust and the Soviet Union and Maoist China and all the suffering that went on. And as he's thinking about it, he finally formulates a question. And he said, I realize now I have a question. Now I can begin to think. And so the whole Maps of Meaning comes out of exploring this question. What could prevent another such traumatic disruption of the world? What could prevent another such catastrophe? And that's what he writes the book about. And so you need a question, right?
Yeah.
So I have a kind of overarching question in my head, which I'm honing more and more as I talk to more and more people. But my question is more about what connects all these different spheres of reality, all these different ways of approaching reality. There's a connection to all of them. I really believe there's a connection to all of them. And so I'm looking in physics and neuroscience and as I move along, I'm getting closer. But I would love to hear your perspective on philosophy. I know you're a Kierkegaard student. Is that correct?
It is. 10 years ago at South Dakota State University, I live now on the West Coast, which I like to call the poignant end of civilization, Western civilization. And I don't say that pejoratively. I just think objectively, when I lived in Grover Beach before coming up to San Francisco, I would go to the ocean and watch the waves at night and during the day. And I just thought, well, this is as far as I can go. I can't walk on water yet. Like, we can't do that yet. Our physics doesn't allow. And yet we can think it, right? And to your point, we can be given a structure and at whim deconstruct it in the form of a question. Powerful stuff. And so Kierkegaard, 10 years ago, near midnight at the South Dakota State University Library, found me. I don't know if you've ever been gripped by an author.
Yeah, obviously Jordan Peterson took hold of me.
So I would love to hear that story. Forgive me if you've mentioned it in the past video. I've been following, may I say religiously, your conversation with Michael.
Oh.
And data compression. I thought that was fascinating in terms of token and poetically understanding the uses of metaphor to get us from A to Z and beyond languages. So we can't walk on water, but maybe we can transfer our intentions across different genres and media. But Kierkegaard 10 years ago gripped me. And it's strange because he gripped me through a translation. He wrote in Danish. In fact, he insisted that for his university education, he not write his dissertation in Latin. He wanted to write it in what he saw as his mother tongue. He was very eccentric, and he was a rebel. In some ways, he reminds me of the Milo Yiannopoulos. I can't pronounce his last name correctly, but do you know who I'm talking about?
Yiannopoulos. Milo
Thank you
Yiannopoulos.
so much.
Yeah.
Where he was, to use Peugeot's phrase or terminology, Kierkegaard saw himself as the margin of the whole circle of Christendom, because culturally, everyone in Denmark, everyone around him in Europe was a ostensive Christian. And they could look at the cross, gorgeous sepulchres and gorgeous arches and naves. But Kierkegaard sat in his room and wrote Fear and Trembling in Danish. And that's what I picked up 10 years ago. And it just gripped me. I don't know if the words gripped me or the context in which those words and my imagining of that context gripped me. When I look at, I've talked to some friends who are very, very obsessed with certain writers or artists, and I find a similar pattern. So talking about connecting the spheres, the things that matter to them the most and they become most fan-ish about is not the words per se, because they can find those words in other arrangements and other people's texts. It's something about the confluence between who that person was and the relation between that person and this work. But it's a mystery because the work, it pales in comparison to what they make of this object of veneration. And that led me from Kierkegaardian bending of my knee to his propositions to an Eastern Orthodox sacramentality, where looking at these paintings, and I just met, my father Edwards coming up. I now attend a Russian Orthodox church, and it's fascinating to get the other side of the ocean view on the same old stories, right? Mm-hmm. The Gospels and so on and so forth, and the lives of the saints. Anyway, I was talking to him and looking at some of the icons, and I looked at it, and he just said out of nowhere over my left shoulder, "They're not portraits, They're not portraits." And he left it there, and I thought, wow. I think there's a connection between that and the history of philosophy. They're not commentaries on ideas and other people's ideas. They're not commentaries. So what are they? If it's not a portrait, what is it?
I have an idea. I don't want to I don't want to wade in if I'm wrong. I might throw us off track.
Oh, please. I don't have anywhere to go in particular.
Okay, well, I was just thinking they're not, when you said portraits, even before you said the word, I thought they're portals.
Mm.
In the sense that Eric Weinstein uses the word portal when he talks about a portal being something that you experience that opens a door for you into another way of thinking. Kind of like that.
So that could be seen as a threshold from one sphere to the next. Because I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you early on when you had mentioned this metaphor of levels, it jumped into my mind the question, what might be a fun way to begin conceptualizing this merge? Would it be that that which unites all the spheres is itself a sphere, larger in scale? Or is that which unites these spheres something like a not sphere, some kind of other integument, like a string idea, or a door that is an exit entrance logic? That kind of 0-1, it is or it isn't, disembodied rule based scheme, or actual topology, an object that, as it were, holds the child of God, that is the all in all.
I'm loving this. I'm loving this because I've had all of those ideas as I've stumbled upon different mathematical constructions that have kind of spoken to me like, oh yes, this is it. But then I'll stumble on another mathematical construction. It's like, well, maybe that's it. My initial idea was that it, and this was just a way to think about the fact that they're connected. This was not really a picture of how it might actually fundamentally be. But my first idea was like the way that computer chips are built now, because computer chips used to just burn the map of all the connections on a single surface of silicon. But now there's so many billions more connections that need to be made that they actually burn an entire layered city into the chip. So there's layer after layer after layer inside the chip. And like, there'd be like cities sitting on top of cities, but where the two layers connect to each other so that the information can move, there are these little channels called via, VIA. And it seemed to me that those connecting channels were kind of like, you go from one layer of information to the next layer of information, you're going up through these vias. And what is it that connects one field of information to another field of information? And the mathematicians say that what opens their eyes into another way of thinking is always where the beauty shows up. So I was thinking maybe beauty is what connects. When you run across something so transcendently beautiful in any field of knowledge, maybe that is the portal that leads you in, that you could use as a map or a key to understand another frame of reference. So for me, reading Maps of Meaning, the key for me was because it's a very difficult book for me, because I'm not very smart. Paul was talking this morning with a guy who said that when he stumbled on Jordan Peterson, it was like it had unlocked a hunger in him to read, and he just became voracious reader. And that is exactly what happened to me. I hadn't been much of a reader of nonfiction before I stumbled on Jordan Peterson, and now I'm just like reading all these things that are beyond my capacity to understand. But as I was reading Maps of Meaning, I realized one day, well, this sounds very much like what I learned in art relative to the elements and principles of design. And all of a sudden, that whole matrix or structure that comes to my mind when I think about the elements and principles of design mapped over onto Maps of Meaning, and I instantly could understand everything he was saying. It was like a translator key. And I think there's something like that. There's a translator key for every body of knowledge, because they're all Well, for one thing, they're all connected because they all come out of the human mind, and the human mind has a certain structure, which I'm realizing now because I'm reading Ian McGilchrist's The Master and His Emissary, which talks about the structure of the brain and the two hemispheres and how they interact. And so it makes sense that every other thing that we've come up with in the world could map over onto that same structure. But there are other things in the world that don't come out of our mind, but that we simply find, right? Like mathematics is something that we just find out there. Why does that also map? Now, you gave several examples. You said it could be a logic, a 0-1 kind of thing. I've also thought about that one, because when you think about the two hemispheres of the brain, it's a completely binary system, which when my next video with Michael posts, we're talking about the binary system there. And I don't want to waste time fleshing it out here, but there's another picture with a sphere of some sort of mathematical structure where they can show 3 spheres that are actually just one sphere, all coming from strings from the inside of the sphere out and filling the sphere. And these strings completely fill the sphere, but there can be 3 sets of these sets of strings completely filling the sphere. So it's almost like this picture of all these things interact with each other, but they never cross over, but they're all connected somehow in the same thing. So I have to go back and do some reread some of that stuff so that I can speak more intelligently about it. But
no,
everywhere you go in mathematics, you see this thing happening.
I mean, it was brilliantly put. Thank you. I love the way in which words allow us to paint sonically. Like I was seeing what you were saying, and I was seeing
Sonic painting. That's great.
Yeah, and I was seeing how the juxtaposition of these images, like a movie, allowed us to see in multiple angles the idea and the argument of these ideas, which is a way of reproducing the question: is what we're going after in understanding these ideas itself an idea, or is it that which we could say is not an idea? And so for a shorthand descriptor, that which transcends ideas as such, begs the question, if it's not an idea, how would we begin to describe its properties? But stepping back from that, one thing, as you were outlining that silicon chip and the layers upon layers of this, so to speak, city of God, St. Augustine came to mind, because with books, you have stacks of pages and they can be compressed. And I thought about what Michael had mentioned in one of your past videos that you had brought out as a very key concept. In other words, the zip bomb, that which destroys paradigms or frames and allows one to, well, actually pushes one outside of their parameter of comfort. Beauty is a proxy for such a explosive. And I think of that line that Jesus gave. I mean, whatever one wants to think religiously about the figure of Christ, there was this fully God, fully man, more than zip bomb container of information that is infinitely meaningful, that in philosophical terms solved the problem. And this is a perennial problem, a perennial question. Wherever we go, we see it growing in our structure or the environment. The problem of the one and the many. How do the many relate to the one? And is the one always primary to the many? Or could it be a summation? Fully God, fully man, the infinite, finite. We can give lip service to the Peugeot idea that the expression of the infinite is itself infinite, but then like in mathematics, you just have the diagonalization of infinite sets that is itself an infinite set greater than all infinite sets. What have we said? You know, how close has it come to the heart? The place where action springs. And so that verse from this paradoxical figure known as Christ. Because before I even say it, there was this Harvard scholar who talked about beauty years ago, and she said something to the effect that wherever you find beauty, you find symmetry. You find, and she meant that metaphorically as you find a place of consensus and reconciliation, because it's, what is symmetry? It's measuring together, which means it has this idea of the outside of the rope. We're measuring something. We're trying to be objective about what faces us. We're imposing a value scheme. And we're doing it together, or trying to. We're trying to gain consensus about our science. And there was this line you had in one of your articles on your website, a quotation from Jordan B. Peterson, which I think is apropos to this symmetrical description of beauty, because in that sense, beauty entreats us. It says, come closer, come together, let's, for lack of a better word, reason together. And you may not understand it all now, but we're going to measure this together. We're going to learn how many inches are in a foot together. And maybe we'll translate to other metric tons together. But if we don't, we'll have discord and it won't be as beautiful. But there's this line that you quoted from Peterson where he says, I do believe there are places where the mythological and literal touch. He does things with language, especially in his sentences. And you brought this out during our meeting when we were sitting next to that painting of the skyscrapers at the coffee shop. You began with a beautiful commentary on his book, Maps of Meaning. And you brought out one of the things that I certainly think he does intentionally, rhetorically. He takes a sentence and realizes, oh, this is a place where I can measure out the choice of diction. I can choose my words. So this is a metaphorical site for my ethic.
Wow. Okay. Give me that again, because I need a minute to drink it in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like a Rubik's Cube,
Mm-hmm.
we're given language like a tabula rasa, a blank slate. And it's so screwed up. It's messed up. Not all the reds are on the left. Not all the greens are on the right. We just, who knows where our words come from? Our parents said things when we were growing up. Our friends say things in our peer groups. And then when we go out into our professional careers, we're given jargon and parlance to learn next to the water cooler about something that happened on Netflix. All these words and lexicons come in and it's messed up. Well, to tell the truth, from childhood to old age, we have the choice from subject, verb, and object, what we will put in there and what we will move. Will it be passive? Will it be active? Will it be direct? Will it be indirect? How often will we repeat the subject in certain places? Are we afraid to? And that means every word we choose is a moral arena. And we can be very, very unintentional and just use stock phrases from the group. Play our identity game of, well, it's a cliche, but it's a useful one, useful fictions. But what he does, and it's very much what James Joyce did with his book Ulysses, was he said, let's hold on. The sentence can be very long or very short, but it has an end, just like every story, just like our lives, just like our thinking. So let me bring attention to one word after another in sequence. And so he writes this complicated sentence. He doesn't just say, I believe. He says, I do believe, because he wants you to have within 3 words his whole philosophy, that cognition is embodied, and so there has to be a motor output function to every idea we espouse. So he puts it right there, I do believe. He doesn't believe, he does believe. He acts as if he does believe. And that came from a simple choice in his verbiage. But it wasn't a simple choice. it was probably born from the 10 years he spent thinking and teaching and repeating himself to students, to where he finally said, oh, I don't believe, I do believe daily. And some days I don't believe.
So Matt, are you going to Savannah?
Savannah.
Have you heard about the Savannah Symposium?
I believe you mentioned it.
You've got to be there.
I gotta go.
You hold part of the solution. I really, this is so remarkable. So in April, there's going to be something called the Savannah Symposium, which is being put on by Stephen Blackwood. Are you familiar with him? If you Google Stephen Blackwood and Jordan Peterson, you'll come up with some interesting YouTube.
I'll write that down right now.
Yes, and also Stephen Blackwood and Roger Scruton. There's some wonderful conversations between them.
I have someone talking.
Yeah, I see. So, so Stephen Blackwood started this thing called Ralston College about 10 years ago because he's trying to start a new way of education, returning the humanities to the world. And obviously he and Jordan Peterson have been in discussion about this. And he put together this thing called the Savannah Symposium in April. Jordan Peterson is going to be there. Ian McGilchrist, who wrote The Master and His Emissary, which I'm currently reading, and several other speakers that I haven't become familiar with yet, but I hope to. And everybody who goes is going to be given a copy of Plato's Symposium, translated by a particular person. We're all supposed to read it and be prepared to have discussion. So I don't expect to get to discuss anything with these big guys, but I will be discussing things with people like you who are also interested in him that are going to be going there. And I am like over the moon excited about this experience, and I'd like to see all these great things become part of this as well. So I want to go back to what you just said, because I love the way you explained it the second time when you started talking about all the colors.
Yes.
In the Rubik's Cube. So that brought to mind a number of things that I want to bring up. And one of them is, have you read the essay by George Orwell about language?
Is that where he gives us the phrase weasel words?
Might be. He talks a lot about how you have to, at all costs, avoid cliche, avoid what he calls the iron cliches. No. I guess it's okay to do the iron cliches, the ones that have become such a part of the language that they now have an actual meaning attached to them. But there are other cliches that are just conveniences that we use to put off the effort of actually communicating what is going on inside our minds. And he wants people to struggle to actually communicate their own thoughts, not recapture the thoughts of others and then use them as shorthand in some sense. It's a really, really interesting essay. And then the other thing that came to me as you were talking about narrative, and I can't remember the context, but what sprang to mind was something I read this morning in The Master and His Emissary. He makes several points. One is that, well, he's talking about the way the right brain and the left brain communicate, which very briefly, this is really surface. The right brain is the one that is always scanning the field of potential, and the things that percolate up to the top, or the things that become evident to the right brain brings in. And then, so basically the right brain is choosing what to acknowledge in the field of potential. And then the right brain sends that to the left brain for processing. So what the left brain gets has already been curated by the right brain. The left brain cannot choose what it's going to decide about. So basically you have two choices going on here. The right brain either permits this information to come in, or it does not permit. So it's not a yes and a no, but it's a no and a not no. Okay? Then it sends this information to the left brain, and the left brain either permits or does not permit. So the left brain is making a secondary choice of no or not no. And then what the left brain accepts, the left brain processes, and the left brain is responsible for language. So that's the language component comes from this initial foray into the unknown by the right brain, and the analytical systematizing, categorizing function of the left brain. They've done a lot of research with people whose corpus callosum had been cut at some point in the past for various reasons. And when they can't communicate with each other, then the left brain can't talk about the things that the right brain is seeing. So very, very interesting research. But the point is that as he's talking about it, he's talking about metaphor being one of those things where if metaphor is if someone reframes a metaphor to shorten it in some way, you completely lose the contextualization of the metaphor at a deep level. So the meaning of the metaphor is lost. Metaphors have to be represented in their complete form in order to have the depth of meaning that they start out with. And he also talks about narrative structure, that when sometimes the left brain can take a narrative structure and systematize and categorize the events in a way that takes them out of the narrative order, because the left brain wants to systematize, wants to make categories. Oh, this thing and that thing are kind of alike, so I'll put them in a category. But when you do that, when you take the narrative episodes out of order, you've lost the deep underlying meaning of the narrative. That just made me think so much about the way many churches teach the various stories from the New Testament to make a point about something. Oh, I'll take this one and I'll make this point and try to drive home this lesson that everybody needs to learn. But they've lost its context in the narrative structure. So the deep underlying meaning that needs to be there has been lost. And I think that in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, they go through a liturgy that takes the narrative from beginning to end and then starts over again. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yes.
The idea of fractals becomes paramount in the,
talk more about that.
Yeah, the Mandelbrot set.
Uh-huh.
In the understanding of the liturgical life. Every minute is measured for the Orthodox, every hour, every day, and every year. And so there is no place where the saints are not. That metaphor in Hebrews, we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, is pragmatic truth. Mm-hmm. Fractally, when every minute is measured. There is someone right now, Karen, actually more than one, but definitely one. Just like you can set your watch to a plane in LAX or what's that place in New York City? It starts with a G. They're always landing planes every other second. It's an airport, and it's frequently used. There's much traffic. LaGuardia, thank you. Even more so than LaGuardia.
LaGuardia.
Thank you so much.
Okay, like Italian, LaGuardia.
LaGuardia. Even more so than that efficiency. Right now, as we speak, there's a monk praying. There is incense being burned. And so not a minute is wasted. There is communication between the upper and the lower levels at all times. I mean, can you hear they're climbing Jacob's ladder up and down. So there is, even before airplanes were lifting off, there was this sense of technology in our phenomenology. That is the way in which we talk about what we're talking about and going to talk about and have talked about according to the tradition of the fathers. So when you had spoken about the process A and the process B, and the process B by which we understand process A and even go about doing process A. So we sit down and write a story, and that takes time, and that time in which we write the story is itself a story. We try to figure out what ideas are, and is that thing we come up with, the interpretation of ideas, itself an idea, or is it that which transcends the idea? It's that A, B thing, the higher and the lower, how do they relate? Is it all shatter into crystalline fractals of, well, your particular experience is your particular experience, and my particular experience is my particular experience, and we just shore up our ruins without interfacing? Or is it everything sums up into that which is greater than the parts? It doesn't have to be that either or, to your point. It can be this functional relationship, and that's where the arts come in. And that's why I'm happy about STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. It's beautiful. It allows people, to your point, to speak DIY language, to take on the self-reliance of implementation, down to the level of clean your room, the meme. But there has to be a useless perfection to hold up as an ideal. Oscar Wilde said, art is perfectly useless, and the emphasis falls on the adverb. Perfectly useless, because it's something we gaze upon to see through. As they say with the icons, we don't look at when we look at an icon, we don't let our eyes terminate on the pigment. We're looking through these things like a portal, a window to heaven. We're using the icon for the virtue, just like when Jesus passed and the woman thought, if I just touch the hem of his cloak, I will be completely whole. And she was, because virtue surged through him. We hold on to the icons not because we're worshiping idols, but because all we do is worship idols. And this is one little rope, little string to get out. Because to your point, if everything is a road of negativity, it's not this and it's not that, so it's not either or. What could it be? Let me process it down with my other brain. You apply metaphor on top of metaphor to get some idea. Well, people get exhausted, especially when you turn about 25 and you just want to settle into a habit. And then that becomes your implicit practical identity for the next 30 years. And being woken up from that, non-ironically, not in the sense of wokeness, but being woken out of that, it's very disturbing and can seem like a terrible tragedy to befall someone. But it's a common occurrence for the lives of the saints to peel back the archive, right?
So in your own life, did you hit something like that when you hit 25?
Oh, yes. So I'm a first generation college student, so I didn't know what I was doing going into all these different departments, seeing these people who had given.
I was a first generation college student too, yeah. So I can identify with them.
Yeah. So I didn't call home and say, so Dad, here's what the theoretical physicist says. What do you say? I couldn't go, hey, Mom, my creative writing teacher wants this done by Friday. How do I power through it? They're wonderful people, but they didn't know what I was talking about. So I went to church. And strange, the church I went to was a small Baptist, idiosyncratic place where everybody was my age except two, and we were trying to read the dead guys, John Calvin, for example. And you take people who haven't finished their bachelor's and you give them the Institutes of Christian Religion. We made too much hay for our own good. And where was I going with this? What was the question? It was not a good deal.
Well, it was about, you were talking about how when people turn 25,
Yeah.
they tend to settle into a pattern that is going to keep them going for the next 30 years. But if you get awakened from that pattern, it can be very disorienting.
It was like this is where I was going with that. So like 1920, I was struggling with the doctrine of predestination that was coming from John Calvin's commentaries. And it was a perfect coincidence with what degree am I going to walk out of here with. Everything became a question of sovereignty, of the upper determining every causal event in the lower. So certainly, if God brought me here, he already knows what I'm going to walk out with. And I thought it's going to be the left hand of my wife, and in my other hand, the roll of parchment that is my career for the rest of my life, upon which I will support children and grandchildren. Neither one happened. The person who was holding my hand, they wanted to go all the way with sovereignty. And I just happened. We were sitting in a car next to an arboretum in Brookings, South Dakota. The rain was falling on the windshield. And I looked over to the passenger side and I said, I think we have some choice. I will never teach my children that. And we were young. So like the movie Twister, our relationship was divorced. The door to the driver's side was flung open and I was cast out, which was fine. All things happen for a reason. But then I just went on this spiral outside of that little 100-year-old church and said, well, I have a soul, which means I have agency. And so I can't accept the God that you preach. And I didn't know any other God. So I left school. I quit. Because, if there was nothing above, then nothing below mattered. It was all permissible, to quote Dostoevsky. One degree was just as good as another, which meant one thought was just as good as another. There was no one to unify the many. And with Kierkegaard, who I had found a couple of years prior, all he said was, if you boil down his philosophy, faith is a passion, not a logic. And so I thought, well, that's as good as it's going to get. I'm going to have an emotional upsurge towards something lyrical that if someone pays attention to, they'll write down and call poetry. That's it. Otherwise, it's just out brief candle and everything signifies nothing. It's just a fool playing his lyre and lying. So I left school. I was trying to be consistent with my conviction that there was no God. Jesus was a metaphor. I just kept saying that. Jesus was a metaphor. But what was the metaphor for? I didn't know. So in 25, I went to Lincoln, Nebraska on a personal excursion. Lincoln, Nebraska. That might not sound like much, but that was like going to Antarctica from South Dakota. And I went without family or friends, and I just went there. And I took a job at the call center of Verizon Wireless. The meaning of the meaning of the word is not lost on me. Horizon of truth. I went to this place called Verizon, and I sat in a cube and I listened to humanity. I listened to America for 40 hours a week for 2 years. And $5 means a lot to most people. And below the $5, to your point about the bottom layer, it's the principle. And people are kind of crazy about principles, regardless of the content. As long as it's in that sentence, that they've chosen the words in this sentence, define my principle. They've made that their moral arena. They will argue until 2:00 in the morning with a stranger on the phone. It was eye-opening. And then I could go on, but I should stop. So I will stop with my awakening from that dark period of agnosticism in Lincoln, Nebraska, taking phone calls for 40 hours a week for 2 years. It was kind of like my Cave of Kiev experience, where I just went into complete darkness waiting for something I knew not. One little thing, this is kind of a lot of people nowadays like to tell painful stories. The book just came out called American Dirt. I don't know if you follow the publishing industry closely, but I'm kind of obsessed with it. This book called American Dirt came out, and it's receiving backlash from all corners of group identities, because who gets to write about pain, especially if it's someone else's pain? And so this danger of everything fractalizing into only I can speak of my personal private pain. But if I use one of your words, I can be hit with the mallet of the judge. So who can speak? The final police state that you had mentioned with Orwell. Mm-hmm. So that's the whole thing surrounding American Dirt, the novel that just came out, which is basically a thriller book. I was just waiting. And here's my painful story. During those 2 years at Verizon, I would wake up at 12 o'clock at night, the same time I found Kierkegaard about 5 years earlier. And I would just get in my empty apartment, and I lived next to a gas station. I'd look at the blinking light, and I got this surge in me, like a volcano in like Washington, slowly erupting right outside my eyes, right in my chest. And then it receded, and my chest became this really painful knot with 3 ropes that wouldn't like become undone. And I knew I'm either having a heart attack or I'm having a panic attack. And I figured it was the latter. So I'd get in my car, and I would just drive to the ER, and I'd sit down in a chair with my little paper cup of water and wave to a receptionist. I'll be good in an hour. And then I'd get up the next morning and go to Verizon and talk and listen. And 2 years, it was so strange. I never went to church on a Sunday. I didn't open the Bible and read it. I went to this old poetry shop in the basement with the cracked floor. I would read French poets and Hart Crane and E.E. Cummings, Wallace Stevens, 20th century gentlemen, and got nothing from it. I just read the cadence. And then, do you want to go to Grover Beach? And I drove and drove and drove, and I came to this ocean, had nothing, no effect on me. And then just one little statistic came to mind. Well, I've heard 1 in 8 Americans live in California. That means there's 1 in 8 of everything here that could be in America. I was 28. I thought my life, was pretty much come to the end, because if there's no God, if there's no organizing principle of all the parts, and I somehow got through a call center job, like all I have left is to write a book and like go up on a mountain or something. 1 in 8. So I checked out everything with Christianity, came to agnosticism. Oh wait, I checked out Catholicism, but there's something on the right side of it. EO, Eastern Orthodox. 1 in 8, it's got to be around here. And sure enough, long story short, came to this little building in San Luis Obispo, St. Andrews, the first called apostle. Come up to the door, it's locked. I walk around the building and I feel like with that knot, but it was finally outside of me. There's something in this little humble building that I got to get into. I got to see. And so I came the next week, and it was open. And I walked in, and I saw icons for the first time. And you talk about those spheres and what relates. My agnosticism was just simply blown away. And the noetic effect of God's presence replaced it. Now that's ineffable, and it can't be explained, but it's the truth. It happened to me.
I'm very moved by your story, but I don't know the word noetic. I've seen it once in a while, but I haven't looked it up. So what does that mean?
So it comes from the, I think, Greek word nous, but it's just a place.
Okay. That's the opposite of phenomenon, right? Because a phenomenon is something that can be touched or felt, or an event that happens, and nous is that ineffable thing that surrounds us.
Yeah, and every person has one, and it's between the heart and the mind. It's a place. So when Peterson talks about, when you're participating or engaged with something meaningful because you feel it, and it's not just a feeling, it's a place you can be and get into and get out of. You can deviate from the way. I mean, to my mind, he was describing the experience of the presence of God, and the presence of God happens in a person's nous. Mm-hmm. It's when So I was standing up on a hill next to my priest, and we were looking at the Golden Gate Bridge, and he was describing his understanding of the nous, and he quoted Saul, in the occasional letter to the Romans, where he said their hearts were darkened when they went out to nature and reversed the teleology. Things don't have a final end. There's no organizing principle above to arrange the particulars into this beautiful Mandelbrot set. It's all just snowy fractals that will melt. No, the moment people start doing that, their nous becomes darkened. And so they can't welcome in, or they can't be enamored by the beauty that you described breaking frames. And these frames, when they calcify, are just idols that make us, that behold them, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to speak. And so, like Peterson said, we can just be little Pinocchios all our lives. It's all connected. You're right. I mean, it's the one in the many. Peterson, Peugeot, Jordan Peterson. I like Theophany just happened on the Julian calendar. And that means revelation of God. It's talking about when Jesus went into the river Jordan and was immersed by John the Baptist, Jordan B. Peterson, the rock of the church. I think it's amazing how his name lines up with certain liturgies. And I'm not saying it's causal, but it's very meme worthy and beautifully illustrative of how things can be compressed. And the phenomenon of Jordan B. Peterson does unravel a lot. And it's very telling that we can get so much mileage out of one person's book tour. I went on and on. Please give me your thoughts.
I have so many thoughts now that I don't even know how to rein them in, because one of the maps that is helping me to understand The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist is when he describes the function of the left brain and function of the left hemisphere and the function of the right hemisphere and how they work together. I get this perfect picture of my husband and myself, because he is a person who is more driven by his left hemisphere, and I'm a person who's more driven by my right hemisphere. We both have both, obviously, and everybody has both hemispheres, but I think there are some people in whom one is more prominent than the other. So the function of the right hemisphere is to be on the alert all the time for all of just this, everything that's out there, right? There's always this infinite field of potential, and someone who is more on the left hemisphere range of the world would have a more focused attention on a particular aim, but someone who's more right hemisphere related sees the whole ball of wax at one time. So for me, I have things coming at me from everywhere. And when I start hearing an idea, I don't just hear that idea, it plugs into every part of my brain. Every data compression that's inside my brain, not every one, but all the ones that relate to that thing just light up. So then I have to decide which of those am I going to talk about without driving everybody crazy. So while you've been talking, a whole lot of things lit up. And oftentimes when I do these conversations, I'll stop people periodically and I'll say, okay, this is what came up for me when you said that word. But I didn't want to stop you because I was so fascinated by what you were saying. Okay, so let's go back to, you were talking about STEM and the arts. So I think it's pretty obvious that STEM is more driven by left hemisphere thinking. And one of the things that McGilchrist talked about was that the left hemisphere seems to have had the primacy in intellectual thinking since Plato. From Plato all the way up to Kant is the way he frames it. The pre-Socratics, he would put in more right hemisphere thinking. And today's phenomenologists, and on the quantum physics side, Niels Bohr, who's all about the probability thing with quantum physics, they would be the ones that would be more open to the right hemisphere way of thinking. I was going to
Yes.
say, I just lost you for a second.
No, I have to plug it in, but keep going. Probability
Yeah.
distribution.
So, the STEM and the arts, it's pretty clear that STEM, what has happened, and I think it's still in the ascendance, is that in science, at least this is the way I see it. I'm going to have a conversation later this week with Ira, and the topic of the conversation is going to be science and humility, or science and the lack of humility. And what I think what's happened is that people who are strictly in their, science has become so atomized that things are highly particularized. So a scientist might be exploring one particular little string his whole life. One particular aspect of a topic might be the thing that he's talking about. And he might never come in contact with the things that are being said by a lot of other people who might be out on the periphery of that particular topic. And so he might be missing some information that's critical to his understanding of this thing. He thinks he's studying it from a perfectly analytical, scientific framework, very logical. There's no subjectivity in it. It's very objective. And so you can call it strictly scientific. But if you're missing information, you're not really strictly objective, because our subjectivity always comes in. The very thing that I choose to study is subjective. Mm-hmm. So how can it be completely objective when I'm studying this thing, right? And that, I think, is one of the problems with what's happened with science. Now, earlier this week, or it might have been last week, Eric Weinstein on The Portal had a conversation with Roger Penrose, which was completely fascinating, because they're both speaking at an intellectual level that is magnitudes beyond what I can cope with. But he encouraged us at the beginning to listen, because he said that's the way scientists always talk to each other. They don't even understand each other. So the reason I saw the conversation was that somebody on Twitter had said, listen to the first 2 minutes of this conversation and you will understand imposter syndrome and you'll never be afraid of it again. Mm. So I thought, well, I have a daughter who's a little bit afraid of imposter syndrome. So I listened to it and yeah, okay, I get it. So I listened to this very complicated conversation about physics and math that's way out at the periphery. But it came up in the conversation exactly what I think about this whole atomization of science, because Penrose, when you listen to his trajectory of how he developed his theories, it was from some random conversation that he'd have with somebody in a car where the two of them are riding back from a conference. Or maybe he's having dinner with somebody else and it has nothing whatever to do with science, and he has a random conversation with somebody. And all along the path, his theory was developed based on these little oddities that show up in the world. So you were talking about how beauty entreats us. I think that that connects with this idea of so many people who are looking at the epistemology of love. You might want to read the article that N.T. Wright put in First Things in February. And the title of the article is Loving to Know. And
just wrote that down.
Yeah. So interestingly, he is laying out the argument for a kind of epistemology that is very similar to something that Esther Lightcap Meek wrote in her book, Longing to Know, and then her second book, Loving to Know, which I haven't read the books yet, although I've read summaries of the books, and I had a lengthy conversation with her, which I didn't have an opportunity to publish. But I don't know how long N.T. Wright has been thinking about this, but Esther Lightcap Meek's thinking about it goes back 15 or 20 years at least. It's this idea that in the infinite field of potential, the things that kind of light up for us are little gifts that are left there for us. And if we receive that gift, we build a relationship with the gift. Now, I'm putting her idea into my language. She doesn't quite state it that way, but that's the way I see it, because when I read Maps of Meaning, the chapter I got fascinated with was chapter 4, which is about anomaly. And when Jordan Peterson lays out his whole argument for anomaly, I began to see something that fit together with everything in the universe. It's such a big idea. I still haven't been able to capture a way to talk about it, but I'll look at two aspects of it. One aspect is this idea that there are things that show up in our field of awareness that we notice, and there are other things that we don't notice. Or maybe when there are too many things for us to notice, if we have an adequate frame or an adequate aim, certain things will penetrate our field of awareness, and they'll become known to us, and we'll begin to think about them and let them process in our minds. And it will, Jordan Peterson talks about those things building the future in front of us, because each choice that we make, we're building the future. The future can only be built out of our choices, and those choices are building our future. So where are those little things coming from that light up for us? Well, okay, so if we have an aim, yes, certain things will come into our perception field, but why do they come into our perception field? Where do they come from? That's one aspect of it. Now, Esther Lightcap Meek would say that those are offerings. Here, consider this. And then I see it and I consider it. Now I've developed a relationship with that thing, that concept or that question that's out in front of me. And then it becomes a part of my knowing, and that it's a kind of relationship of love, this back and forth, this knowing thing. So keep that in mind, this looping thing. That is a very important symbol of something. I had two things I was going to tell you about. Oh, anomaly. Let me go back to that later. But while we're on the looping thing, when you listen to Roger Penrose, you'll hear him talking about things not being unidirectional, but there's a looping that's going on. And when McGilchrist is talking about the way that the mind works, in the past, they used to talk about the structures of our cognition, our brain function as being like little modules where the thought moves from one to the next module in a linear fashion until it reaches a conclusion. But he said that's not actually the way that the brain works. It actually moves through these neurons in a kind of a looping fashion and keeps coming back and re-engaging and coming back and re-engaging. So this also has something to do with that binary, right? I mean, you're looping back and forth between 2 points. And now going back to anomaly, I'm covering a lot of ground here, but the idea of anomaly, the thing that hit me about that is that I've had a problem with evolution for a long time. And some of the reasons why I wasn't able to completely accept that evolution was the way that we got here. Well, let me lay out this framework first. I think both special creation and evolution are compelling narratives about how we got here. And however God wanted to do it is fine with me. But it's obvious to me when I look at evolution that something comes in from outside the system. It's not possible for evolution to be the full answer of how we got here. But I have read a lot of evolutionary theory. I've looked at a lot of the evidence for evolution. And the one thing that to me they cannot explain is where the information came from. When you listen to John Lennox, he's always talking about that. He says, it's obvious that there was a mind behind DNA, because DNA is basically a code or a word that has 3.4 billion letters in it, and they're all in a perfect order. So where did the information come from? So as I'm reading evolutionary theorists, some of them say, oh, well, that's easy to explain because the first cell had a very small amount of information in it. Of course, they never explain where that came from. But the first cell had this small amount of information, and then this cell is confronted by an anomaly. They don't use the word anomaly, but I'm throwing it in there. First cell is confronted by something to which it must adapt. Something that is unusual in the environment comes in. Now it has to adapt to that something. And in the adapting, it has to develop some new something, some new information that allows it to navigate this problem. And now the next iteration of that cell has this knowledge in it, this epigenetic function. And then it, becomes more complex, and then a more complex organism. At every level of complexity, that organism comes into contact with some anomaly, something to which it must adapt, and it's the adaptation that increases the information in the DNA. Well, that's reasonable to me. I can believe that might be possible. That might be a possibility. But then I ask the question, where do the anomalies come from? Because the anomalies always seem perfectly suited to the need. This thing is going to develop some sort of a new capacity. It runs into an anomaly perfectly suited to that need, and then it develops that capacity. And that looks to me very much like the picture of how we live. We run into anomalies, difficulties, traumas, and we need to adapt to them, grow, process. We grow through our sufferings and our struggles. And when we get to the other side, we look back and we say, oh, there was a purpose in all of that. So the present rewrites the past. So it's looping back into the past. It brings the past back into the present, makes sense of the past, makes beauty out of the past, and then we move forward into the future. So there's always this kind of looping thing around these anomalies. So I'll stop there. But anyway, that's one of the pictures for me of how these things all fit together.
It was an amazing meta-mythological story you told. One thing I observe is a theory. Penrose was kicking the can of the theory down the road with his friends, and it brings to mind what a theory, the word, shows us. I mean, it's just a way of seeing. We look around and we see the can and we kick it. Oh, it's a kickable thing. One thought leads to the next. It has some impressive quality to it that can be impressed. And so we begin to articulate something like a story. And that beginning, middle, end, if it's sufficient unto itself, can be compelling for others to, if they don't kick the can, to rattle the beginning, middle, end between their ears and accept the theory. When you talked about that little particle adapting, I mean, that's the hero's journey.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Applied to DNA, applied to the species. Now the scientist wants to say, but it's objectively verifiable underneath the microscope. Yes. Well, when I look in there, I see a lot of green and some food color with some stuff. If I'm being honest, like I took anatomy and I looked at the little stainless steel pins inside organs that were chemically treated to not disintegrate. And I just saw a lot of what looked like gray tissue. that I could blow my nose with. This was a heart. Was it? Is it? I mean, I can repeat the word heart, but is it a heart? I mean, when we say beating heart, we're speaking metaphorically, using drums and bass and all these pump ideas. So like, what story are we trying to tell ourselves when we look at cadavers or biological stuff? None of it makes any sense until we apply some generic mold that you did so wonderfully. But the relationship between the ability of us to left brain wise process the green food colored stuff with things that arbitrarily can be assigned to different communities and groups, right? Every single identity group can tell the hero's journey about themselves. And that's fine. It can actually bring together an ecclesia, a church of all these redeemed and saved heroes. But when we turn the sword against our fellow man and say, the hero's story is my story and therefore not yours. You don't get it. This is mine. Mm-hmm. And we confuse the ability of the story to arbitrarily mold itself to any kind of organism, any situation, with our own interior subjectivity. Like if you were to take a microscope and look inside, this green stuff, this beating heart is actually objective reality. And the little hero story is simply mine. And I think that's where you get a lot of resentment and victimhood. Like, I'm not trying to just weave that story, but it's the mistake of thinking something universal. And this is where Kant comes in, right? He talked about the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative. Hypothetical imperative was basically the great commandment of do unto others as you would have them do unto you, what Christ said. But Kant said, act as if. And maybe this is where Peterson got the act as if, I believe. Posit a universal ethic, and then act as if that was true for everyone. Treat everyone as if they're in your game. There is no, in the Kantian sense, then identity politics, because everyone's projecting a world that everyone else belongs to. And so there can be grace and room for, oh, you don't understand yet what's going on? That's okay. Let's sit down and have a cup of coffee. I'll explain to you my universal ethic. I'll use my words wisely and my sentences as conduits for this universal ethic I'm giving everyone the benefit of the doubt of being in. But when we're like, oh, no, you're taking my word out of my moral arena sentence and putting it in your sentence with a different subject and a different object, that's not allowed. Stop it. You know? And it's, so when
that
you were
sounds
talking,
a little bit to me like, now I haven't read Kant, but the concept sounds a little bit to me like C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man. Have you read that?
a while ago.
Well,
I don't remember the argument.
His argument in Abolition of Man is that we all inhabit the same moral structure. And it becomes obvious when you look at other people, not when you look at yourself. So when if you get on a bus and somebody steals your seat from you, you get angry. That was wrong. He shouldn't have done that. Okay, that's part of the moral universe. And all these things that upset us because they are impinging on us, those are rules that are part of the moral universe that are shared by all people. All people share the same set of rules, that things that offend us or upset us.
See, and that's the right brain. From what I'm hearing in that is that's the right brain acknowledging there's this wider paradigm, this wider domain where a lot can enter our field of focus. And to your point, most of it, 99.99%, enough to land a plane on safely, is gratuity, pure grace. Mm-hmm. That the one that enters now my field of vision is exactly what I needed. I just didn't know. And therefore I could not have asked for. It couldn't have been the content of my prayers. Prayers are so interesting because we're supposed to sit down by the side of our bed, as Jordan B. Peterson says, and just ask for enlightenment. But what do we know about enlightenment? What do we know about I need when I speak to an invisible entity that I'm not altogether certain if such entity exists, because I don't even know what it means to exist, if I'm being completely honest. I mean, we're not even sure about single-celled organisms, to your point. Like, what are we really going after when we sit by our bedside and use the word existence and enlightenment? And so prayer is this, I mean, it's already shipwrecked if we think about it before we do it. And so I think vigilance becomes an important aperitif to stimulate us into engagement with what will come in our field and not be driven out because we think it's a foreigner to hurt us. And what I mean by that, what I'm trying to get after, is the right brain brings it, and the left brain wants to, or the whichever one is the other one, wants to immediately put it in a white suit and quarantine it for a while until it has it all figured out, guts and all, and then it can present it with suit and tie and a career, a career idea, a life-defining goal, something great to talk about.
Well, yeah, and going back to your thing about intersectionalism and identity grouping and so forth, I think that is fundamentally, it's interesting because, people accuse the identity politics people of being snowflakes and being too much on the feminine spectrum and so forth. But I think it's a problem of over-categorization.
I totally agree.
Definitely a left hemisphere function. And it's that over-categorizing that creates the problem. And back to the idea about prayer, to me, and we probably need to wrap it up at that, but because we have been going for a long time. The idea about prayer is that, for me anyway, I came to this conclusion a long time ago, that God gave me the opportunity to pray because it changes me. Not because it's going to, he already knows everything I need. He already knows the right thing to do. He's in possession of all the information that in the universe. He's in possession of everything. So his thoughts are so far above my thoughts. What do I know when I pray? But I notice that when I pray, as I pray, if I'm actually engaged in the process of praying, my words begin to change. My thoughts begin to change. I start out trying to pray one thing, but as I go, it changes into another thing, because my awareness and my understanding of what's going on grows as I pray, and my words begin to say something more real and true. And the other thing that prayer does for me is it puts me on the alert to see where God shows up. Because if I have prayed and asked the Lord to be involved in some problem that has come up recently, we became aware of a woman who's suffering some extreme problems, and we began trying to help her and work with her, and we've been praying for her. And so when I hear of something that has gone right, I can see, yes, that's what we were praying for. And it strengthens my faith. So it begins to create this looping thing again. Mm-hmm. Now, some of that may just be cognitive bias. I don't know. But it opens my eyes to be on the alert for God sightings. And for me, that's always a plus. When I'm connected to God in that way, it's a plus for me. So that, to me, that's what, I mean, I do believe that I'm actually communicating with God, but that's not necessarily, maybe other people can't understand it that way. I mean, Jordan Peterson, the way he described prayer, it almost sounded like he was communicating with his psyche. But for me, it's communicating with a real being. Not a being who's out there, outside the universe, but a being who is completely suffused inside this universe. So,
can I say one thing next to that?
Yeah.
So when Paul says in the letters, the occasional letters to his friends and to people he knows, that we should pray unceasingly.
Mm-hmm.
There are many levels to that, but one in our day and age when we can look around and see a meme for this, and our environment is giving us so many different cues, it is, among other things, a training in consciousness. To go back to your loop, if we pray unceasingly as a theory of moral conduct, what might that look like? Well, to take that idea of I do believe, there are places where the mythological and literal touch. We talked about these spheres and how they relate and hook up. A prayer is a sentence, maybe many, wherein if we receive a tradition, we're given the words in order. We're given a moral domain to train in. And then when, like you said, we look outside of our echoes of those prayers to people, to the mirror, we can see different, we've trained our salience to see things, little details of things that otherwise would have been low resolution. And then the effect of that multiplies to when we go back to that same prayer, maybe at the same time, more is exegeted, drawn out for us. And then we go out into the world and we find more and more details. And yes, someone who's jaded could say that's a bias to get yourself into a hole. But if that hole is in fact light of light, very God of very God, then as Lewis would say, everything else will be illuminated by its light. And then we get to write our own sentences with the strength of the training to choose our words appropriately. And it isn't top down from a government, it's top down from the Christ. And anytime you try to plant your flag and say this is the Christ, you're wrong, because prayer does reveal itself in our finitude and frailty. But yet that's where the love is. So it is quite a flow state, was where I was trying to get with all that. The Vervaekian flow state, there's a sense in which it's bad when we just parrot the ideologies and we're ideologically possessed and all we care about is a degree or a career or an ambition. But there is a good side to the flow state. And if we're constantly given up to the transcendent, then we can finally be of earthly good. Because we're never beholden to anything. We're free. The truth sets us free, so we can actually go to work and work.
That is a great place to stop, only if we can do this again.
I would love to.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. That was fantastic.
You have a good day, Karen.
Thank you. You too, Matt. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.